Someone you loved died today. Not today in the literal sense, but somewhere in your life, you have stood beside a grave, or held a hand that went cold, or sat in a room where the air felt different because someone was no longer in it. And in that moment, without being taught, without being told, you knew that something had to be done. You knew the body could not simply be left. You knew there had to be a ritual, a ceremony, a goodbye. You did not learn that. You inherited it. The impulse to honor the dead is so old, so deeply embedded in what it means to be human, that scientists have spent decades arguing over exactly when it began. And the answer, when you look closely at the evidence, is far stranger and far more ancient than almost anyone expected. It starts in a cave in South Africa called Pinnacle Point. The year is roughly 120,000 years ago, but to understand what happened there and what it means for you, you have to go back even further, much further. In 2015, a team of researchers led by paleoanthropologist Lee Berger announced a discovery that shook the entire field of human origins. Deep inside a cave system in South Africa called the Rising Star Cave, in a chamber so narrow that only the smallest members of the excavation team could squeeze through, they found bones, hundreds of them, belonging to at least 15 individuals of a previously unknown human relative called Homo naledi. Homo naledi had a brain roughly the size of an orange, a third the size of yours, and yet the bones were arranged in a way that could not be explained by accident, or by flooding, or by predators dragging carcasses underground. The only explanation that fit the evidence was deliberate, intentional. The bodies had been carried deep into the cave and placed there on purpose. Homo naledi was burying its dead, or something close to it, and Homo naledi lived at least 250,000 years ago, possibly much earlier. This is the part that stops most people. Because 250,000 years ago, the creature performing something that looked unmistakably like a burial ritual did not have the brain size that scientists once assumed was required for that kind of behavior. It did not have complex language as far as we know. It did not have the cognitive architecture that researchers long believed was a prerequisite for grappling with death in a symbolic way. And yet there the bones were, placed deliberately, in the dark. Your ancestors were not the first to feel something about death. Something older than your species did too. Now move forward to the Neanderthals. For most of the 20th century, Neanderthals were portrayed as brutish, primitive, incapable of real thought or feeling. That picture has been almost entirely dismantled by the fossil record. Neanderthals buried their dead. This is now beyond serious scientific dispute. At a site called Shanidar Cave in what is now northern Iraq, archaeologist Ralph Selecki excavated Neanderthal remains in the 1950s and 1960s and found something extraordinary. One individual, now known as Shanidar 4, was surrounded by dense clusters of pollen from at least 8 different plant species. Selecki argued the body had been laid on a bed of flowers. The flowers' interpretation has been contested. Some researchers argue the pollen may have been deposited by burrowing rodents or natural wind movement. But even setting the flowers aside, the burial itself is not in dispute. Neanderthal bodies at Shanidar and at dozens of other sites across Europe and the Middle East were placed in deliberate positions, sometimes with their knees drawn up toward their chests, sometimes oriented east to west in alignment with the rising and setting sun. These were not accidents. These were choices, and here is the part that should make you pause. Neanderthals are not your ancestors in the direct sense. They are your cousins, a separate branch of the human family tree that diverged from your lineage roughly 500,000 years ago and went extinct around 40,000 years ago, and yet they buried their dead, which means the impulse to do something with a body, to mark the end of a life with intention, was not invented by your species. It was already present in the common ancestor you shared with Neanderthals, or it evolved independently in both lineages at roughly the same time. Either way, the conclusion is the same. The need to honor the dead is not a cultural invention. It is not something that emerged with civilization or religion or philosophy. It is ancient, it is biological, it is part of what the human family does. But why? What is the evolutionary logic of burying the dead? Anthropologist Ernest Becker spent his career trying to answer that question. In his 1973 Pulitzer Prize-winning book, he argued that human civilization itself, art, religion, architecture, war, the drive to achieve and be remembered, is largely a response to one terrifying fact. You know you are going to die. You are the only animal on Earth that lives with that knowledge every day, and the awareness of your own mortality creates an anxiety so profound that your entire culture is, in part, an elaborate system for managing it. Burying the dead is one of the oldest tools in that system. When you place a body in the ground with intention, with objects, with flowers, with ceremony, you are doing something that transcends hygiene or practicality. You are asserting that the life that ended mattered. You are creating a boundary between the living and the dead that gives the living permission to continue. You are telling yourself and everyone around you that death is not simply an ending. It is a transition, a passage, something that deserves witness. That assertion is so powerful, so necessary, that it appears to have emerged independently in multiple branches of the human family tree across hundreds of thousands of years. The objects placed with the dead tell their own story. At a site called Sungir in Russia, dating to roughly 34,000 years ago, researchers found the burials of an older man and 2 children. The older man was covered in thousands of mammoth ivory beads, arranged in patterns that suggested they were once sewn onto clothing. The 2 children were buried head to head, surrounded by carved ivory objects, fox teeth, and spears made from straightened mammoth tusks over 2 meters long. The sheer labor involved in creating these burial goods was enormous. These were not practical objects. These were statements. These were acts of love and grief and meaning-making that required time, skill, and enormous emotional investment. And that emotional investment is the key. Because grief, real grief, the kind that makes you want to do something with a body rather than simply leave it, requires something cognitively sophisticated. It requires memory. It requires attachment. It requires the ability to hold a model of another person in your mind and feel the absence of that person as a wound. It requires, in short, a kind of love. The capacity for grief and the capacity for love are the same capacity, viewed from different directions, and both of them are ancient. Psychologist John Bowlby spent decades studying attachment and loss in humans and argued that grief is not a disorder or a malfunction. It is the activation of the attachment system in the absence of its object. When someone you love dies, your brain keeps reaching for them, keeps expecting them, keeps scanning the environment for their presence. That reaching, that scanning, that refusal to simply accept the absence is what drives the need for ritual, the funeral, the burial, the ceremony. These are not just cultural performances. They are the brain's way of processing the transition from presence to absence. They give the attachment system somewhere to go. Your ancestors felt that same reaching 34,000 years ago at Sungir, 250,000 years ago in the Rising Star Cave, perhaps even earlier in moments that left no fossil record at all.